Join our Patreon.
Do you really want to know? We are Myth Vision.
Welcome back to Myth Vision Podcast. Your host, Derek Lambert. And today we have John Knight Lundwall, Dr. John Knight Lundwall. How are you doing, Doctor?
Doing great, Derek. Glad to be back.
I'm
so
glad.
Soon.
I know, man. This is good, though. Every time I enjoy when you come on because it's not as strenuous on me. I don't have to. I don't have to pull stuff out of you. You have so much information, ladies and gentlemen. He's the author of Mythos and Cosmos: Mind and Meaning in the Oral Age. And John's thesis is an interesting one. If you're not familiar with his work, go down in the description. You see the book on the screen. Go check out the book, because for the longest time, I'll spare you the details. He might even touch on it as we do the show. He usually does, because he has a unique position on this. It's when you go back to oral people prior to writing, a lot of people, if you will, actually, you know what, John, I'll let you break this down, because you're the one who's the expert in the field here. But in particular, your thesis on the orality to written and how that works from mythologizing history to historicizing mythology. You've touched on this prior, but in your book you go in depth, which your thesis is completely different than all the other mainstream people in this field, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, actually, there's a lot of innovative. Look, I spent years studying different theories of myth, and quite shockingly, in the 20th century, every theory of myth omitted orality studies. So, I mean, the lacuna is so enormous. How could you miss that? And so, I spent several years reading, Havelock and Ong and Goody and people in the field since the 1960s who developed the orality sort of way of looking at history. And none of this, there's scholars that argue against them, right? I mean, the scholars will argue against everything. But once I began implementing this kind of field of study into my main field of study, which is ancient mythology and ancient religion, and then adding to it something that the orality guys missed, and that is ancient cosmology, because that's everywhere. Then I've got a synthesis. We're going to talk about that tonight. After watching our last podcast, I thought I would jump into sort of the origins of the biblical creation story. And of course, in the text, nothing is explicit. It's all implicit, right? We're getting fingerprints of the oral tradition. And so we're going to try to sort of dig them up and see how, looking at how oral societies function, how might that change our interpretation of the biblical text, the biblical cosmology? Because, ancient Israel, well, actually, Derek, we know almost nothing about them, right? The Torah is written pretty late. And actually, Derek, we know almost nothing about First Temple Judaism. I mean, it's amazing how little we know about huge blocks of history. We know almost nothing about the origins of the pharaohs. We know nothing about the origins of the Mesopotamian city-states. We've just discovered in the past, I guess it was the late 1990s, when Göbekli Tepe was discovered. You're aware of that site, yeah, right? It's 9,000 BCE. It's a temple with stone pillars, gorgeous stone-cut megalithic features, art, and it predates everything, not by a century, not by a millennium, but by thousands of years, right? And it's so, I mean, it just goes to show that our view of history is so incomplete that one historian actually looks at it and says, well, it's rather depressing unless you choose to ignore it. And so that's what we got. Hey, we got a little Damon in
Hey.
the picture here.
He heard Göbekli Tepe and he said,
yeah, that's
he
right.
said, stones, can I play with them? All right, buddy, we're doing the show.
Is this
Go tell your mom.
is that Derek Jr.?
No, that's Caden.
Oh.
You already are. Go ahead, poke your head one more time. He said, can I be in the show?
Hey,
You're in the
Caden.
Say hey to everybody.
Hi, jeez. Hi,
Hey.
hi, Caden. Nice to meet
I
you.
always been on my cornies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, now go get mommy. Go get mommy. Go get mommy. All right. Sorry about that. So, yeah, this is, I mean, what you bring up is interesting. And if we don't know anything, and I don't want to stop you from where you're going, so keep that in mind if you wanted to keep rabbit trailing. If we don't know much about that, all we can do is go off of the sources we have, and maybe even the sources that the biblical authors were using in developing some of this stuff. It can kind of say a lot, I think. So you were saying, I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, so for most of prehistory, our sources are oral, so we don't have them; they're gone, and so all we have are, you know, a few scraps of archaeological debris, and you can't recreate history by looking at pottery shards and a few statues. Archaeology doesn't tell us anything, almost nothing about the ancient thoughts and metaphysics of ancient cultures, and as a result of that, we have filled in their metaphysics by subsuming 99,000 years of human history under sort of this Darwinian paradigm of, you know, pre-rational, semi-primate, you know, evolving out of the cave kind of thought. We either do that or we romanticize them and say, oh, you know, they're super spiritual and they're shaman warrior priests who are connected with the landscape. Academics do this. They're either a primitive slack-jawed yokels, or you know, they're romanticized. No one, you know, no one ever seems to want to take ancient people, as in people living 5, 10, 50,000 years ago, and say, well, maybe they were just like us, right? Either they were, you know, semi-evolved Homo sapiens, or, you know, we romanticize them. But what we don't say is, let's assume that they're pretty much just like us. Why are there so many differences? And so we'll talk about.
Yeah,
We'll talk
you go
about some
into
of
that.
tonight.
You go into
Yeah.
that. The hardware was the same. I mean,
Boom. Right.
Yeah, you ask scientists today, and I mean, like, according to the consensus, if you will, approximately, we're 200,000 years old in the
That's
model that we're in, technically.
That's correct.
Feet, hands, brain size, everything. So, you know, I heard Randall Carlson once say this, which I love watching his stuff too. He said, you know, if we've only got approximately 5,000 years at best of the oldest written literature, possible literature that we have of writings, and this is not in like regular letter, alphabetical type
That's
letter.
right. That's right.
You know, he says, what happened to the 195,000 years of
That's correct.
human history? So I'm with
That's
you.
correct. Exactly. But, you know, as we start peeling back the layers, I mean, they've now found hundreds of henge sites throughout Europe dating to 5000 BCE. So this is 2,500 years before the Great Pyramid, and they're henge sites, as in, you know, the precursors to Stonehenge. They would be wooden hinges surrounded by a ditch with 2 or 3 openings. Some of them are aligned to solstice, sunrise, and sunset positions. So already, you know, 5000 BCE, we've got evidence of astronomical observations. Well, why wouldn't we? Why, you know, the human beings 5,000, 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 BC, they domesticated animals, they domesticated plants. You know how much work, you know how much intellectual intelligence that takes? But somehow we just want to put them in the dumb box. And in any case, this has nothing to do with tonight's presentation. But actually, let's get to tonight's presentation.
Yes, sir.
All right, Derek, you know, I always try to PowerPoint my podcast. I am a very visual guy. So, you know, that's why I do this. And I think it helps people. Some people, you know, they just listen to the audio, but some people actually watch the YouTube video. And if they do that, then they can at least follow along. Tonight, I thought, again, we're going to talk about biblical cosmology and the origins of the creation story in Genesis. Now, and of course, this is the reconstructed origins, because we just mentioned we have so little as far as, you know, the oral tradition doesn't survive. We get fingerprints of it in the biblical text, and that's what I'm going to try to follow tonight. Let's see if we can lift some of those fingerprints and see what that might do for us. In order to enter our discussion, I'm going to set up some context. In the ancient world, Derek, all oral societies had a creation story. We call them their creation myths. But again, myth, the word myth is not an ancient word. They didn't have that word. They never told a myth. That's our category that we assign to them, right? Because they're, you know, proto-rational, pre-scientific, half-evolved, you know, people. So they are dealing with myths. Turns out myths are very rational observations of nature and the cosmos as conceived of by oral minds. All right, so you said it. They're operating on the same hardware that we're operating on, but they are operating on slightly different software. Orality structures thought, literacy structures thought. So this is an entirely different epistemology, an entirely different way of codifying, storing, and transmitting knowledge. And we've forgotten it. So we have to reconstruct it. It's not easy to do. All right, so one thing we know is all oral societies had a creation story, a creation myth. This story was the most important one. Now, the way a lot of these creation stories are treated, both in popular culture and in academia, Derek, is that, you know, sometimes we treat them as like they're campfire stories, or, you know, the stories that you gather around and the priest tells you, like maybe like at a church meeting, right? But that's not what creation stories were in the ancient world. So let's give a couple examples. Well, actually, let's hop to the next slide here. This is my contribution to myth studies. This is how oral societies layer, store, codify, transmit their knowledge from generation to generation. Okay, they start with the knowledge that has to be transmitted, and this is an oral society's cosmology. Their cosmology is the observations of nature, of the above and the below, of actual nature, trees, rivers, you know, seasonal cycles, etc., you know, crops, agriculture, migrations. But they noticed early on, at least by the very early 3rd millennium BCE, because that's all we have evidence for, but you know, obviously now that we're finding hinges throughout Europe dating to 5000 BCE, some of them, you know, opening up to solstice position, sunrise, sunset, that we know that they're observing these things going way back. And again, we have to remember, Derek, that Egyptian religion appears in a thunderclap. You know, we've got pottery shards and post holes and a few little figurines, and then pyramids and pyramid texts, right? And the pyramid texts show this grand cosmology and religious system. Well, where did that come from? Well, it had been developed by the people with the pottery shards and the little figurines and the post holes, right? That was already developed in prehistory. We have no writing. And so, you know, that alone should tell us, wow, okay, so things are going on at a very early period that we know very little about. So the bottom line is they would notice when a certain star rose on the horizon, a plant would bloom, or that was the time to harvest, or this is when the animals migrated into the valley, right? And so they had these heaven-earth links. And over time, that they learned how to hunt, how to gather, how to agriculture, how to farm by observing the processes of nature of the above and below. And so they would pass this knowledge down in three different ways: using memorable narrative, that's myth, and myth is codified so that it's memorable. It has outsized figures, oversized scenarios, monsters copulating gods. It really is kind of childish gibberish by the time it comes to us. And for the longest time, that's what people just thought it was. If you don't expect anything other than childish gibberish from this stuff, that's all you're going to get, right? So it's only been over a couple centuries of some very smart people relooking at it, realizing, oh, a lot more is going on here with ancient myth. So myth is memorable narrative of the oral cosmology. But, when you don't have any writing, you need to layer your memories in different mediums. And so myth had a partner, ritual. They acted the myths out in songs and dances and festivals and chants and in rituals and liturgies, right? And so ritual was somatic narrative, bodily narrative that copied the myth. And then they all created, as far back as we can see, a sacred space by which they measured and observed the cosmos, told the myths, and performed the rituals. And the sacred space became a fundamental part of creating the society. In Mesopotamia and in Egypt, Derek, you could not build a city before you built the temple. You built the temple first. That cosmicized the land. That allowed you to create order out of the chaos, because nature, it turns out, the romantics say we want to get back to nature. I've got 195,000 years of human history all shouting at us, don't, we're trying to escape nature. It's horrible. Toil. And so the temple was built as a way to organize the society so that they could basically subdue nature in the agriculture, in the rituals, in the myths. That's how they created their society, their city, their village. And so this pattern here, the cosmology, the mythology, ritual, and sacred space, is different mediums by which oral peoples pass down the information from generation to generation. So the bottom line is, if the Bible begins in oral tradition, and now pretty much every Bible scholar says so, right? I mean, everyone's in agreement on that. Where the disagreement starts one step after that, and that is, what does that mean? What does the oral tradition mean? Most Bible scholars still treat the oral tradition like a fuzzy literate one, right? That there's still, they don't treat it what's on your screen. If there's an oral tradition, then there's going to be a mythic element, there's going to be a ritual element. Somehow the sacred space is going to be revealed in it, and there's going to be a cosmological underpinning to it. The question is, can we find that in the creation stories in the Bible? And tonight, I'm going to show you, in fact, it's actually there. It's all there.
Nice.
In shadows and fingerprints. But actually, once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's pretty evident. I thought I'd go back just to this slide. All societies had a creation story. The story wasn't a campfire story. A creation story in the ancient world, Derek, it almost acted like a founding document for a modern society, like the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. So, let me give you an example. There's a ancient Egyptian festival. It dates to the Old Kingdom. So, early 3rd millennium BCE. So it's early stuff. And the festival was called the Opening of the Year. This is their New Year festival. I really should look this stuff up before I think it's Wenet Renket is the Egyptian name of it. And so what it was is it occurred at the rising of the star Sirius after the star Sirius had disappeared for under the horizon for 70 days. That was when the Nile inundated and flooded, and and so the water overrose the banks of the Nile. It left black soil that was very fertile on the fields, and that is how the Egyptians survived. They took that soil and planted their crops in it, and year to year that was their agricultural cycle. Okay, but it was associated with a celestial cycle, and it was also associated with the flooding of waters. Now, this becomes very important because at the opening of the year, they are celebrating their creation mythos. The water that rises on the Nile, I mean, some scholars have argued, you get a lot of these Near Eastern creation stories where the earth is the first dry land that appears out of the waters. This is what we get in the Bible. And it's what we get in Egypt. And so as the creation story goes, there's the waters above, waters below, and then the earth first rises out of the waters. Well, some scholars have noted that maybe the primary metaphor there was actually the inundation of the Nile, because the water rises, it fertilizes the earth, by which you plant your Garden of Eden, right? By which you grow your crops. This is the renewal of the earth, the recreation of the earth with the inundation of the Nile. So some scholars have argued that it's the inundation of the Nile that provides the basis for these early Near Eastern creation stories of the first dry land appearing out of the waters.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
I think it does make a lot of sense. Last year I was in Egypt. I'm rabbit trailing already, and I promise you this will be under 90 minutes. I am so sorry. But last year I was in Egypt, and I was 500 yards away from the Great Pyramid on the causeway, and we were there's a shaft there called the Osirian Shaft, and it's this 60, 70 feet vertical shaft cut in the rock. And there's an old rusty iron ladder that you can climb down into it. I can't believe they let us do this, because the ladder was hanging off, and I thought maybe anyone, someone's going to die doing this. But anyway, so I was at the Osirian Shaft climbing down. There was a tomb down there at one point, and this is underneath the causeway that leads to the Great Pyramid. And as I climbed down, there's limestone bedrock, and I saw. Fact. Do you see that? I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah.
That's a sand dollar, right? Fossilized sand dollar. I bought one of those because that's what I saw embedded in the limestone, a fossilized sand dollar.
Wow.
And then I realized, these guys are cutting so much stone. I mean, all these monuments, pyramids and temples and obelisks, right? And as they cut through the stone, it's filled with fossils that are all sea fossils. And so quite frankly, it would be very easy to say that the dry land appears out of the waters above and below, because that's their actual experience. They're cutting the rock and they keep running into sea fossils, and some, they don't know plate tectonics, but they do know that somehow the earth itself is filled with sea fossils.
Wow.
So how does that work? What's really interesting, though, still rabbit trailing here. I will get back to the topic. If you look at that sand dollar, that 5-pronged image is the exact image of an Egyptian star. That's what they carve on their ceilings in their tombs and temples. And so the star is actually the image of a fossilized sand dollar, right? And it makes you realize that the waters above and the waters below, they represent it as a starry region, right? And the earth emerging out of it. We keep going to terrestrial images, so the Nile and maybe the oceans, but as I'm going to get into here, they resolved this as the starry world was the primordial waters. In fact, it's the Milky Way, right? In Greek cosmology, in the creation story, Oceanus surrounds the flat disk of the Earth, and Oceanus is the Milky Way. And so, in any case, I'm back here to the creation story, the opening of the year. They celebrated this festival. During the festival, they celebrated the death and rebirth of Osiris. That was part of it. They celebrated the creation. They celebrated the inundation of the crops, and this is their planting season. And so the creation story then has all these fingers. It has a religious element in the Osiris cycle. It has an agricultural element in the crops. It has a political element as the pharaoh and the royalty oversee it all. And once you understand that, you realize, this creation story is actually sort of the entire network of how the society works. It's running their agriculture, their economy, their religion, and their politics. That's what the creation story was doing. And so, no, it's not a campfire story, right? It is a festival. It is a ritual. It is a myth. It is a cosmology. It's being kept in tune with Sirius and the agricultural cycle, the solar cycle. It's all of that. And that was, and so as we go outside of Egypt, we find the same patterns in ancient India. They would celebrate their creation story on the day of the new year, and all the inhabitants of a village or city, all of them, would show up together and perform a ring dance around the village or city. And this was a reenactment of the creation. It renewed the created world, recosmicized. This is what the Egyptians are doing when the land gets refertilized with the inundation of the Nile. They're just analogically performing a ritual that renews the world, right? Based around their temple, because the priests are the ones that dance around the temple. The citizens dance around the village or the city. And so we get these patterns. And my point is, we're going to have cosmology, myth, ritual, and sacred space as part of the oral tradition. Can we track that in the biblical creation narrative? And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. One more thing. I've totally shot my timeline, so I'm going to go as fast as I can, Derek. I apologize.
Okay.
There's one more thing I want to talk about, though. And that is ancient oral cosmology is a radically different way of seeing the world. This is part of that oral framework of thought that we have lost sense of entirely. And but we get hints of it through our texts. We have to remember, I'm going to give different examples, but every culture applies it a little bit differently. Sometimes, and then we're talking time frames over 3,000-4,000 years, and things aren't going to be the same over that time frame. And so it gets really difficult to try to piece this back together. But here's what we know. In ancient Iran, there was this idea, this belief that everything on the world that you see was a shadow or reflection of an eternal pure form or archetype that resided in the heavens. Every tree, river, mountain, stone actually was a copy of an eternal tree, river, mountain that existed in the heavenly realm. Now, why would they think that? Now, not only that, but every city in Mesopotamia, every city was dedicated to a star or constellation. And they did this in Egypt. Traditionally, there were 42 nomes or villages up and down the Nile in Egypt. And each village corresponded to a field in the Book of the Dead. And that field is a celestial zone that the dead traveled through as they sought, the secrets of rebirth, right? And so they would build a village, assign it a star constellation. And so when Pharaoh sailed down the Nile, he was sailing through the cosmos from village to village, right? And so again, Euripides' Bacchae, the play, the initiates of Dionysus have a heavenly vision where they see 2 suns and 2 cities of Thebes, each with 7 gates. Well, what are they seeing? They're seeing the actual sun you see with your eyes, but its eternal form in the heavens, meaning that the sun gets its light from another source. It's eternal source that we don't see. And so this is a radically different. So how do they come up with this kind of thinking? And I think in part, I've already mentioned, they would watch a certain star rise on the horizon or reach its zenith. And at that same time, they would see certain plants bloom, or that's when you planted or harvested, or certain animals, birds would fly in, certain migratory patterns, or, winds or seasonal aspects. And they connected the two, and they said that star is causing this plant to bloom.
Good
right?
point.
This is the basis of ancient astrology. Okay. And so somehow that star holds the invisible power over the natural laws of nature that we see.
This is powerful stuff, by the way, John, the way you're connecting this.
Yeah.
It really makes perfect sense, because we now that we're a written society,
That's correct,
can compartmentalize. I'm gonna make it in
Boom.
dumb terms, because I'm a man and you're a man, right? I can't multitask worth a damn. But I can tell you what, in the ancient world, to survive, they multitasked it like they were pros. I can only imagine the women probably came up with a lot of this stuff too, because they said, oh, this connects to this, but the men too. This is really cool, because before we get off the village stuff and why you're connecting this, there have been books written by people who think of astrotheology, and they go, I know that it's probably Occam's razor. Here we go with another literary, what seems to be from our perception, the correct understanding. And there's no way to prove or falsify what I'm saying here, but there's no way to prove it either. The city like Bethlehem and what it means, and it might have significance to a celestial story even in the New Testament. And if that is the case, which you can't prove because we're so logical and all about like, well, there was a place Nazareth? People, yeah, there was. No, there wasn't. Well, what if there's something else going on that we can't wrap our heads around? So I love what you did there, connecting those two, because if we were back then and didn't know what we know now, of course the volcano god and the star god would connect to life, and when life would rise, we recognized the stars that were behind why, and we would make those connections. And we think that's dumb today, but really, you don't wake up in the morning and see a certain star, or at night you look at night sky and realize, you know what, in 3 weeks from now, approximately, we're about to have harvest. I mean, we don't think that way. You know what I mean?
That's correct. And you're right. So this is part of the software of the ancient oral mind. They're analogical thinkers. Literate minds are analytical thinkers. We compartmentalize, just as you said, into different categories. We separate it out, and that actually allows us to create really abstract categories, which leads to microchips and refrigerators, right? Oral peoples think analogically. If A is similar to B, there's a relationship. I'm going to pay attention to that, and I'm going to connect them. Okay, and so if the star rises on the horizon at this time, and I have 2 weeks to plant my harvest, then that star is the harvest star, or the planting star, and there's another star that's a harvest star, right? And so and therefore the power of fertility and planting is in that star. The power of the harvest and the growth and the fecundity is in the other star. And so and then they start assigning religious identifications, as in, well, now wait a second, if that star causes this plant to grow, maybe that star is associated with resurrection. And maybe if I analogically bring, ritually copy the rising of that star in a ritual that'll help me plant my soul in the next life, and then I go through the cycle where I get resurrected in the next life. So they're analogically copying these things. But now, so here's the problem, though, Derek. What I've just said, they had a very sophisticated metaphysic connected to this that no one can reconstruct.
Right.
So it's very easy to sit down, and most of our textbooks are this way. They say, well, the mystery religions are, it all comes from personifying the agricultural cycle. Right? And one, I'm showing here on this slide that actually the agricultural cycle was the material manifestation of a celestial cycle, right? And so, and so, when we actually read the pyramid texts, no one knows what they mean, but what we do know is everyone's traveling through the stars to become a star. They're not traveling through the fields to become a cob of corn, right? It's all astral imagery. And so, and it's the same with the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's the same with the temples, which are reflections of the macrocosm. They're bringing down the powers of the eternal world to cosmicize the land in the material temporal world. All right.
Real quick before you move on, because I know you're about to. I was wondering if the orality of connecting things the way you did, the way you were explaining how they connect, I wonder if that found its way into writing, chiastic structures. It appears there's an orality to chiasm, or the chiastic literary structures utilized by writers, where they would connect, one thing, and you might not hear it for 3 or 4 sentences, and then they connect it again in almost like a poetic, almost like there's a sequence to it, a heartbeat to the literary device being used there in a chiastic way. I don't know.
Well, actually, so the writers of the Bible, gosh, they're geniuses. Some of the stuff they do with the text, and maybe we'll get into it tonight. I've already blown my timeline. I'm trying to get this in under an hour and a half.
Please go ahead.
Most of this is not part of my presentation, so I've got to move on. But
move on, brother. Move on.
But I think you're right that just to add to that, I'm talking about the foundations of astrology, and I think astrology as a science emerges sometime in the middle to early 3rd millennium BCE. And what happens there is it's this oral way of thinking, this oral cosmology wed to the new invention of writing, because the Mesopotamian astronomical priests had a word for the constellations. They were star writing, and they were literally the writing of the gods that, if you could read, would foretell the future. If that star foretells when this plant needs to be planted and harvested, then this other star just might foretell whether the king wins the battle or not. I mean, again, we don't think that way, but analogical thinkers think that way. And now that they have this new tool of writing, they begin overlaying that on the stars and constellations. And now everything is a written message. And this turns into a formal science. The academy is the ancient temple priest cult. And they're all trying to read the writing of the gods using astrology. And what was astrology? It was a way to manage the state, right? We even get ancient astrology wrong. It wasn't birth charts. No, they were actually trying to manage the state, to try to get everything in the city state to match what the cosmos was doing in its annual cycle. If you could do that, you would have a powerful city state. Your crops would never fail. Your king would be glorious in battle. So they're just trying to line everything up to the cosmic cycles and trying to interpret that. And so bottom line is, let me move on. Dreamtime, that's the Aborigines of Australia. They have a tradition where all people are related to the stars. People come from the stars. This, by the way, is huge in Native American tradition. the tribes descend from the star world. You know, the Hopi, I don't have time for it. The Hopi, whenever a newborn baby is born, they recognize that the soul in that infant just came from the star world. So they'll take the newborn and put it in a completely dark room, no light, for 20 days. Only the mother and a couple women can attend the baby, because the baby is adjusting from the pure realm of the star world to the material realm, where it's a tough life. You have to get up the next morning and go hunt a buffalo and find some plants to eat, and you know, it's a tough life. And so there's this sort of beautiful symmetry where everything, starting with the human being, is belongs in the star realm, and the life is preparing yourself to return to the star realm. All right, so we get the same. The Iroquois Native Americans believed in a race called the Ongwe, which are star people who manage the plants and every material thing you see on the earth. Well, this reminds of this last example, Plato's allegory of the cave. This is another reflection of the same kind of thinking, where Plato says that you know, all of our human experiences is like we're sitting in a cave, and everything we see is really just a shadow on the wall, and the reality of it exists behind us in the true heavenly world, where the realm of pure forms, and we're just looking at the shadows. And he actually is quite literal about this in his book Phaedrus. Phaedrus ascends to the heavens, where he sees the true heaven and the true earth and all the true pure forms. And so what we're dealing with then is a cosmology where reality exists in the heavenly world, and everything we see here is a shadow, is a copy. And in order to sort of maximize the fertility and the creativity and the potentiality in this world, we're going to try to copy the stellar cycles or the star world in our culture, okay, and in our religion. All right, so now the question is, do we find this kind of pattern at all, whether it be the oral template of cosmology, mythology, ritual, and temple, whether it be oral cosmology in the eternal forms or archetypes in the heavenly world? Do we find this at all in the creation story of Genesis? Because if it's there, then we're looking at a fingerprint of the oral tradition. Because once they write it down, most of the stuff disappears. I mean, how do you write that stuff down? When you write a myth down, you're just writing a narrative, and everything that's attached to it, the rituals, the temple, the agricultural cycle, and all these secret religious aspects to it, none of that gets written down, right? And so do we find any of this in the creation story? And it turns out, actually, yes, we do. So I'm just going to quickly blow through this. You know the 7 days of creation, Derek, right? Day one, the foundations of the universe are laid with a statement that Yahweh makes, or Elohim, and that is, let there be light, right? Now, when is the sun, moon, and stars created? Do you remember?
The fourth day.
That's right, the fourth day. So if we have to wait till day 4 for the sun, moon, and stars to be created, which, by the way, is where we get all our light, then what is the light on day 1?
Right.
Right? It's not the light of the sun, moon, and stars. So what other light is there? Well, that's thinking very modern and materialistically. Mm-hmm. But in the ancient world, there is a eternal light above the sun, moon, and stars. And it's this eternal light that the sun, moon, and stars get their light from. They've reversed it, right? So that's not the way we think, but it turns out that's what's embedded in the creation story. So day 1, let there be light. Day 2, by the way, Elohim lays the foundations in the universe by sparking the scintilla, the the light of the universe, the eternal light of the universe, and by verbalizing it. Let there be light. The
Spoke.
idea, the spoken word, the idea that the universe is created by the word, John 1, in the beginning was the word, and the word was with God, and the word was God. That's a very old idea. That it goes into Egypt, right? The Shabaka stone, Memphite theology. Ptah creates the universe by uttering the God word, right? And so this is millennia before, well, centuries before Christianity. Some scholars would argue millennia before Christianity. All right, so day 2, we have this interesting thing. The waters above and the waters below are separated. And again, most of our textbooks, still in modern academia and biblical studies, tell us the waters above are the rain clouds and the waters below are the oceans or the salt waters. And this is how they conceived of the universe. Well, I just went over that actually the rain clouds have an eternal archetype in the star world, and the oceans have an eternal archetype in the star world. And so what is it? Is it the rain clouds in the oceans, or is it, is it a firmament beyond this world? Day 3, the first dry land appears out of the waters. All right, so then we get the next 3 days. And there's a parallelism that exists here that, hopefully you can see. Day 1, there is light created, but day 4, the sun, moon, and stars are created. Day 2, waters above and below are created, but day 5, the birds and fish, or the material existence of the above and below, are created. Do you see that?
Yeah.
First dry land on day 3, but all the living things on the dry land, the material existence of the dry land, occurs on day 6. In other words, the first 3 days are the eternal archetypes of creation, and the next 3 days are the material manifestations of creation. So this is an echo of that old-time cosmology where everything existed in the star world. Now, yes, the Hebrew scribes have altered it a bit, but you can see, yeah, actually the imprint is still there. And then, of course, day 7, we have God who rests after the 6-day creation cycle. But the Hebrew word for rest really should be reside. He resides over his creation because now he's not taking a nap. He is residing in his temple, which is the microcosm of the macrocosm he just created. Now, suddenly, this links us to, that opening of the year festival in Egypt, where Osiris resides in his temple at the rising of the star Sirius, the inundation of the Nile, as the world is recreated. Yahweh resides in his temple at the first day of the year. We'll get into that. As the society renews their covenant with Yahweh by reciting their creation story. Any questions?
No, that was the chiastic structure. I was kind of referencing that earlier. Oh. That was on point though.
Hey, your screen's covering part of my quote. Hopefully I can remember it. All right. So that's point 1 about the creation story. The sequence actually has a parallelism in it, which kind of shows us that there probably was an original oral cosmology that we've talked about. Now we've got something else that I think is really interesting. In Plato's Timaeus, there's this dialogue between an Egyptian priest and Solon. He's one of the founding fathers of Greece, one of the ancient wise men of Greece. He supposedly lives sometime around 700 BCE. And the dialogue is really interesting because the Egyptian, are you familiar with it at all, Derek? The Egyptian priest, he basically says, "Oh, you Greeks, you're such young, foolish children. You think that you're all that. You are at the end of a very long history that you've entirely forgotten."
Is this the Atlantis reference?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it starts getting into that. But this conversation specifically, the Egyptian priest says, look, civilization collapses over long periods of time. The creation is destroyed. And here we have the quote. There have been, and I can't read it. There have been and continue to be many disasters that have destroyed human life in many kinds of ways. The most serious of these involve fire and water. So the priest is saying periodically there are great cataclysmic floods and great cataclysmic fires that level civilization, and people have to start over. And what's interesting is he actually gives a date. He says, so long, the last time the great cataclysm happened was 9,000 years before your time. Now, where's the Egyptian priest getting this? And of course, modern scholars are arguing over this. Some of them say it's a mistranslation. It's not 9,000 years, but it says 9,000 years, right? So, that's 9,700 BC, the end of the last ice age.
Right.
The Egyptian priest is saying, 9,000 years ago, there used to be a mighty civilization in Greece, but it was laid waste. And so just now you're starting to eke your way back up out of the pothole, right? So he's talking about these large cycles of creation, destruction, recreation that go through global floods and global fires, or worldwide floods, which to them would be everything they knew, right? So that's Plato's Timaeus 22c. Now, so what, how far did that cosmology extend? Well, it's coming from an Egyptian priest, which means that the Egyptians had this cosmology, right? And by the way, that dialogue, the Egyptian priest recites the myth of Phaeton, which is the Greek chariot driver. He goes to the house of the sun and says, I want to drive the chariot, the solar chariot, and Helios is his father, and Helios says, you really shouldn't do that. I promise you can do anything, but please don't ask for that, because you're not strong enough to control the solar chariot. And Phaeton says, no, give it to me. And so he drives the solar chariot, and he can't control it, and the sun careens too close to the earth, and it burns. And it careens too far away from the earth, and it freezes and floods, right? Here are these creation cycles, right? And so finally, everyone is complaining that this guy is killing everyone on Earth. So Zeus takes out a thunderbolt and kills the chariot driver. He falls to the earth. And what's interesting is the Egyptian priest recites this myth. It's a Greek myth, but he says, "Oh, we have this myth. The problem is we do not recognize this myth in any Egyptian writing, right? And they'll have different names, Horus and Set and Osiris, but we can't figure out where it is in the Egyptian writing, which tells us either we haven't found it or there are aspects to Egyptian writing and mythology that we're totally clueless about. I think it's both, because we are totally clueless about it. But again, what's really interesting is the Egyptian priest says, you think this is, a myth of the chariot driver and the sun, but really it's about the declination of bodies that orbit the earth, that move around the earth. And so it's tracking long time stellar cycles. And that's an eye-opener. That's like finding Göbekli Tepe, right? You get this little hint in the dialogue of Plato that the Egyptians are tracking, stellar cycles apparently for 9,000 years. So, where's this coming from? What are they doing? Well, again, academics will argue and conspiracy theorists will argue. The truth is we don't know what to do with it. But the bottom line is the earth goes through creations, floods, and fires. Well, it turns out almost all ancient societies also had a flood story. They all had a creation story. As far as we can track, almost all of them had a flood story. And it was the American folklorist, Alan Dundes, who noted that the worldwide flood stories are almost always associated with the respective creation stories in a culture. In other words, wherever there was a creation story, a flood story was associated with it, right? And so what is going on there? And do we find this in the Bible? is the Noah's flood a reflection of the creation story? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you, I'm going to blow through this as pretty quickly. Okay. Your viewers, I've got all this PowerPointed. They can look up the scripture references, but I'm just going to show intertextual comparisons between the creation account and the flood account in Genesis to show that, in fact, the two stories are the same story. Okay. So let's do this. Creation account, Genesis chapters 1 and 2, flood account, Genesis chapters 6 through 9. We begin, by the way, this isn't an exhaustive list. This is just what I pulled out of the hat when I put this together, right? There are a lot more comparisons to make. Genesis 1, 6, and 7, the waters above and below are separated, preparing for the first dry land to appear. In Genesis 7:11, when the flood occurs, the same verbiage is used. The waters above and below commingle. It's a reversal of the creation, but it's the same verbiage, the same imagery as the waters above and below are used, one, to create the world, two, to destroy the world. Genesis 1:2, spirit moves upon the water. This engenders the life and fecundity in the cosmic waters. Genesis 8:9, Noah sends a dove upon the waters. The whole point of this is Genesis 1:9, the first dry land appears out of the waters. Genesis 8:11, the dove returns with a leaf, indicating that the first dry land has appeared out of the waters, right? These are parallel motifs, point for point down each story. Genesis 1:11, vegetation, animals, man are created. Genesis 8:16 through 19, Noah lands and he releases all manner of life, vegetations, animals, and man upon the world. Genesis 1:28, God commands Adam and Eve to multiply and replenish the earth. Genesis 9:1, in the exact same language, God commands Noah to multiply and replenish the earth. All right, so here are just a few parallels to show, Derek, that the flood story in Genesis is a mirror image of the creation story in Genesis. So what is going on there? Well, first off, we know in all other cultures, the flood and creation stories are linked. And so, yes, that's true of the Hebrew, the Israelite account. It's true of the biblical account. But then, you know, as Plato says, there's also a destruction of fire. Do these links continue with the story of Lot and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah? And it turns out, yeah, they do. So let's track those down. So now we're going to go with the flood account, and we're going to compare it to Lot's account. And it turns out, Genesis 6:5, evil fills the world, by which God says, enough of this, I'm going to destroy the world. Genesis 18:20, Sodom and Gomorrah is filled with evil, and God says, enough of this, I'm going to destroy the cities. God vows to destroy the world, Genesis 6:7, God vows to destroy the cities, 18:21. The exact same verbiage is used in Genesis 7 and 19. Rain floods the earth, and fire rains down from the heavens on the cities. The parallels are meant to be seen.
Right, obviously.
And so Genesis 7:13, only Noah and his family are saved. Genesis 19:15, 16, only Lot and his family are saved. And then here is one comparison that I think is really interesting. And by the way, I don't know what to do with it, but in Genesis 9, after Noah, you know, the ark lands on Mount Ararat, he releases the animals, the world is renewed, recreated. That's the purpose of the flood story in part. And then we get this really interesting scene where Noah becomes drunk and he collapses in his tent, and his sons walk in. They see his nakedness. They cover him up. And then Noah wakes up and realizes that someone saw his nakedness and covered him up. So he curses the child that covers him and blesses the other children. Okay? Well, what's that all about?
Good question.
But then we have a parallel scene with Lot. So Lot escapes Sodom with his 2 virgin daughters. Remember, there's that whole scene where, you know, the people of the city want to take the angels that have come to Lot and, you know, do whatever they want to do with them. And Lot says, no, these people are under my protection. You can take my daughters instead. Right? You can rape them all you want. And so this is really, it's odd. And the text doesn't explain that. It just states it as matter of fact. But Lot is meant to be a foil to Abraham. So there's an internal logic to what's happening here. But Lot becomes drunk because his daughters think that the whole earth is destroyed. This is a echo of the flood narrative where the whole earth is destroyed. Lot's daughters leave Sodom and Gomorrah, and as they think all the earth is destroyed, no one's left to repeople the earth, and so they get their father drunk and impregnate themselves with him. And so there's irony there. He offers his daughters to the mob, and they refuse, and in the end, he's the one that impregnates his own daughters. I mean, it's brilliant irony that the scribes are purposefully embedding in there. So it's almost an ancient version of Shakespeare going on there.
This literally goes back to Genesis 3:2 with Adam being naked.
Boom. Right. And so exactly. So both of these are a parallel to the creation account, where Adam and Eve are naked. The serpent says, "Eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil." Eve does. She causes Adam to do. They realize they're naked, so they clothe themselves. And then God shows them and says, "Who told you you were naked?" And he offers a curse and a blessing. So that's the point. We have the same motif in the creation story. It's repeated in the flood story, and it's repeated in the fire story. And so we have these parallels running between all these stories, which are really interesting. So now the question is, why is that? So there's a couple explanations. One explanation is, well, maybe the Hebrew writers just decided to parallel these stories in this way, the way they wrote them. You know, just sort of, you know what, let's just make these stories copies of each other. The other explanation is the origin of the stories were copies of each other. That was retained in the oral tradition. So when the scribes wrote them down, they retained it, even though they modified each story, but they kept the parallelisms in there. And I think that's probably the accurate answer. Originally, the creation, the flood, the fire, all belonged to the ancient cosmovision of the Israelites. Okay? And so then these stories retain basically the parallels and copies of each other. But now, do you remember this slide? This is the oral tradition, right? If a story descends from the oral tradition, would we be able to find elements of each one of these different mediums embedded in the story? Okay, we've just gone over some of the cosmology and the narrative itself, which is the myth. Is there any ritual imagery or temple imagery in the stories? If there is, then we might be, this is our tell that this belongs to an ancient cultic oral tradition, right? Which, by the way, might help us reinterpret the text. We don't have to interpret it as a literal, newspaper editorial. The earth is 7,000 years old, right? This is a completely different cosmology and a completely different epistemology. So maybe we should just, step back and say, we don't have to go there, right? Well, it turns out, those fingerprints are in the text. So I thought I'd point those out. First, let's start with the creation story. And I've already mentioned this in our last podcast, Derek. If you compare the creation account of Genesis 1 and 2 with the account where Yahweh tells Moses in Exodus chapter 40 to construct the tabernacle. This is the first time the temple is built in the Mosaic era. Okay. If you compare these two accounts, what do you find? Well, actually, here's what you find. Day one, Genesis count, the foundations of the cosmos are laid. Step one of the erection of the tabernacle, the posts and the stakes and the foundations of the tent are laid. Okay, that seems pretty simple. Day two, the firmaments, the waters above and below are divided. Step two, you divide the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple via the veil. You place the ark in the Holy of Holies. So this literally is dividing the sacred space, the firmament above and the firmament below. Day three, the first dry land appears and the fruit of the earth appears. Step three, you insert the tables. So the Holy of Holies is called the Debir, and the chamber outside of the Holy of Holies is called the Hekal. There's a veil that separates them. When you step through the veil, there are two cherubim that are in the Holy of Holies that guards the Holy of Holies. There's a throne, and there's the Ark of the Covenant, and it has been argued in the earliest temple traditions, the menorah or seven-tiered candlestick was in the Holy of Holies. In later times, that gets put in the Hekal, in the chamber outside of the Holy of Holies, okay? So step three in erecting the temple, you place offering tables in the Hekal. This is the chamber outside of the Holy of Holies. And on the table, you place bread. This is offering bread, but it's not the offerings of sacrificial animals. It's the offerings of the fruit of the earth. And so it's a parallel to day three where the first dry land appears and the fruit of the earth appears. Day four, sun, moon, and stars are created. Step four, after you place the table and the bread, is you light the candlestick and the lamps in the temple. Now, it's dark in there. Why don't you do that right up front, right? Why as soon as you put the ark and the veil up and you separate the Holy of Holies from the Hekal, it's dark. Why don't you light the lamps then, right? Why do you have to put the tables in and put the bread in and then light the lamps, right? Well, actually, they're just following the sequence of the creation days. That's why, right? And so day five, life in the air and waters. Step five, you burn the incense, which is representative of the life in the air, and you slay the sacrificial animals, okay? Day six, you create the animals. There's a little overlap there between step five and day six, and humankind is made on day six. Step six, the priests are anointed to become high priests so they can enter into the Holy of Holies. Day seven is a day of rest where God resides in his temple. Step seven, after all that happens, the cloud of Yahweh appears over the temple where God resides in his temple. Bottom line is this. When you compare the creation account to the construction of the temple account in Exodus 40, what do you get? You get two parallels of each other. So I would think, Derek, you would stop at this point and say, what's the creation account about? Is it about the creation of the world, or is it about the creation of the temple? And is the creation of the temple that's a microcosm of the macrocosm, so maybe it's both. But the Israelites didn't separate them. In any case, this has nothing to do with 7,000-year-old Earth or dinosaurs or any of that. We are now entering into the sacred cult of the Israelites. And by the way, also in chapter 40, we're told this happens on the day of the new year. This is the exact same thing that's happening in that Egyptian festival of the opening of the year. It's the day of the new year where they are celebrating the creation story, the inundation of the waters over the fields, and the death and rebirth of Osiris. In the Hebrew account, it's the day of the new year. They erect the temple. They are literally acting out the creation account by building the temple and anointing the priests. Okay, and so we have these parallels that are going on.
So before you move on,
Yeah.
there's a few ways to interpret this that I've heard. Some people will speculate based on these parallels that the Genesis 1 is technically an allegorical code, if you will, for literally just talking about the Mosaic temple built by in the time of Moses. So technically, everything prior to Moses that we find is all just an allegory or a symbol of later things in Israel's history. There's a lot of people who interpret it this way. So they look at the temple and they see these parallels and they go, wow, well, guess what? Genesis 1 is. It's the temple at Mount Sinai. It is Israel's temple. Now, I'm open to that. I'm open to this already being a temple that's there, that this is initiating its temple language. But to devoid that from the reality of the world around them, as above, so below, the principles, like you said, on not being able to disconnect those, I think you can't just throw out the cosmology of, in some sense, we're not talking ex nihilo here either. We're not trying to say out of nothing God spoke, okay? But it has this implication of creation to the actual material world that we do see around us and above and so forth. And that, to me, is a careful reading is saying it's both, not saying, oh, this is really a code, wink, wink, only about the temple, which has no relation to they didn't think God really created heaven and earth and everything in it and animals and men and all that. No, it's really just a secret code for Mosaic creation of the temple. And they called that the creation. So technically there is places where you can find where the Mosaic creation is the temple and God's people, Israel and such, and he calls it the creation. But is it only that? Because then you start running into problems, in my opinion. You redefine things like what death means when Adam dies. And this is a common tool that's used by a group of theological-minded people such as myself called full preterist. I had to stop here to kind of give you something on why this is important. They don't really have this in the back of their mind. They want to be theologically correct to make sure the Bible is harmonized to the end. And what they've done is they said, well, when God said in that day you eat of the fruit, you'll surely die, he wasn't talking physical death because they would have died that same 24 hours. That's how they define it. Instead of saying now he is now mortal rather than immortal. And that's the way I look at it. But I used to look at it the way they look at it. And one of the things I don't think the deep human normal thing to think about is death is something we all encounter. And if you don't think they had a story on why death is, the literal physical death, why it exists, and that they had a hope for something beyond that in this story, then I think you're missing the point. What they've done is they've redefined the term. They say death, and no, it's an allegory for spiritual death or covenantal death or something where they just weren't right with their covenant with God, not physical death. But to me, in my research so far, as I've left that movement and began to start looking bigger, just like there's a creation account to all worldviews, there's an explanation behind death for many of them as well, and a hope for something beyond or something like that. That's kind of like the rabbit trail that happens. If you think Genesis 1 is only talking about the Mosaic covenant at Mount Sinai, only, not saying it wasn't written around that time, it wasn't incorporating the actual temple there, but creation itself, as we have in a sense understood, not out of nothing necessarily, maybe they did have that idea, but it's not what I'm implying. I guess what I'm saying is like John Walton, I'm sure you've heard of him.
Oh, yeah.
You know, the mode in which creation is active. See, the guys will say Adam is Abraham or Adam is Moses. This is how far the interpretive method goes for them. They say that everything prior is an allegory to something later in history, in Israel's history, and that Adam is actually the one with the law, knowledge of good and evil, which would be probably Moses, or they would say it's Abraham. And they go so far as to go all the way when Paul says, from one man, all the nations of the earth. Well, wink, wink, from one man, Abraham, all the nations, 12 tribes of the land. That's how far they interpret things. So I wanted to mention that to you to kind of give you why I think your method of saying it's both is important. They couldn't disconnect it and just say it was just this. There was a bigger picture in their mind, as well as a microcosm, the macrocosm.
Well, right. I'm linking this to oral society and oral cosmology, and so So what you're talking about is that's recontextualizing. And I'm recontextualizing it by saying this is how oral societies work. So this is the matrix in which the early Israelites would have lived. But look, we have huge lacuna in our text and in our history. It's fascinating that there's no mention of an afterlife in the Old Testament until the book of Daniel.
Right.
Right. And so most scholars say, well, the Israelites didn't believe in an afterlife. Right. The famous Hebraeus Robert Alter, I love reading his translations, says, there's I think it's the story of Balaam, where Jacob's afterlife is mentioned. And in a footnote, Alter says, well, they didn't have a belief in an afterlife. So he retranslates the word afterlife as after time. And he says, because they didn't believe. I find that really hard to believe, that there was no belief in an afterlife by the early Israelites. In fact, I don't believe that.
I'm with you. In fact, even if the text doesn't say it explicitly in cases, you've shown enough evidence connecting it to things like Egypt and other ancient Near Easterns, where they did traverse an afterlife experience in some way, so.
We know nothing of the actual esoteric rituals that occurred in the tabernacle, in the temple of the Israelites. All that we're given, we get the animal sacrifice, we get the sacrificial lamb ritual every year, where the sins of Israel are laid upon the lamb and it's sent out into the wilderness. That's all we get, and a lot of scholars assume that's all there was. I don't think so, right? Again, in these ancient oral societies, the most sacred things are never written down. The most central ritual elements of the temple would not be recorded, ever. And so there's so much we do not know. And
it's like the Freemasons. I heard, like, there's a secret thing that, like, if I tell you, I'm going to have to kill you. And it's like, I found out later, if I'm not mistaken, someone was like, it's a handshake. And I'm like, what the? Like, who gives a crap about a handshake? Anyway.
All right, let me just move on. So, look, if there are temple images in the creation story, and the flood story is a repetition of the creation story, are there temple motifs in the flood story? Right? Well, let's look at that. Again, I'm just going to fly through this. Genesis 6:22. Actually, there are only 2 times in the Torah, all of the Old Testament, the Tanakh, where God explicitly instructs man to build something, to do something. And that is his instruction to Noah to build the ark, and his instruction to Moses to build the tabernacle. And it turns out that there is an execution formula in the Hebrew that is used in both accounts that are identical. When Noah finishes the ark, I should have read this before I did the podcast, but it goes something like, and Noah finished the ark, he did all that God asked him to do. And then in Exodus 40, the exact same verbiage is used, and Moses finished the tabernacle. He did all that God asked him to do. It's a weird grammar that's used, but it's an execution formula. And scholars have noted they're identical, and therefore the Ark of Noah and the tabernacle of Moses must be related in some way, right? Well, it turns out they are. And then, of course, we find that Noah has to take a pair of every animal on the ark, but then in another account, he has to take 7 of every animal on the ark, and they have to be clean and unblemished. Well, the clean and unblemished is the sacrificial animals of the temple. And so now there's a cultic background to the animals in the ark because they are the sacrificial animals of the temple. And so again, this is a motif that that the ark is the temple. Genesis 7. So this is really interesting. We're told in Genesis 7:17. This is a little bit esoteric, but the waters covered all the hills and mountains. And so this is where we get the idea that the flood is a global flood and it covers absolutely everything. But there's a tradition in Jerusalem that the Temple Mount that the temple is built on, it's called Mount Zion, is the tallest mountain in the world. The problem, of course, is Mount Zion is surrounded by other mountains that are much taller than it, right? And so what is happening is it is metaphorically the tallest mountain because the temple is the connecting point between heaven and earth. It is the place where you reach the heavens from the earth, and that's why it's the tallest mountain, right? So the whole point of the waters being above all the mountains is to get the ark above them all. It's the tallest point that connects heaven and earth. It's a temple motif. We do not recognize that. The ancient writers would have recognized that. Of course, there's in the legends of the Jews, the temple was founded over the Apsu, and Near Eastern temple ziggurats were all founded over the Apsu. This really connects to our Epic of Gilgamesh, which is one of the sources for the Noah story in the Bible. If you're familiar with that, Gilgamesh goes to the underworld to find the secrets of eternal life, and he meets Utnapishtim, and he asks Utnapishtim, how do I get eternal life? And Utnapishtim says, I'll reveal to you the secrets of the gods, and he tells him the flood story. And in this story, Utnapishtim builds an ark, right, which is a 7-storied cube. Well, a cube isn't a boat that floats in the water, right? So what is that? That doesn't even make sense. Well, turns out the ziggurats were a series of stacked cubes, and some of them were 7 layers of stacked cubes representing the 7, ancient levels of the cosmos. And so Utnapishtim's ark is a temple, and it's built to travel through the Apsu, the underworld heavenly waters. And so we get this cubic imagery that is temple imagery in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And so returning to the Hebrew temple, the Holy of Holies is a cube that is built over the Apsu. According to the legends of the Jews, there is a hole underneath the Holy of Holies, which leads to the heavenly underwaters, right? The underworld waters. And so the temple cube, I actually have tracked this image of the cube as the sacred space through multiple traditions in Greece, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Bible. And so it's actually a fascinating discussion that one day when we talk about the great flood myth all by itself, we can get into. Anyway, and so the ark is constructed in 3 vertical levels. The temple is constructed in 3 horizontal levels: Holy of Holies, Hekal, Outer Court, and these are the 3-tiered universe. And so the bottom line is there is tons of temple imagery in the flood story, just as there's tons of temple imagery in the creation story. So again, they're layers of each other.
Heaven, earth, and sea.
Heaven, earth, and sea. So now, is there any temple imagery in the story of Lot? Can we track it there? And it turns out, this is where it ends. Because the story, Lot is used as a foil. So we only get one motif in the whole story. Abraham goes to Lot. They have so many animals and servants that they both can't live in the same place. And so Abraham says, you pick. You can live in the valleys or you can live in the mountains. And of course, the mountains are associated with God and the sanctuary, right? And so Lot says, well, I'm going to live in the valleys by the cities. And the whole story is an anti-urban Ptolemaic, right? The ancient Israelites were herdsmen and they hated the cities. They thought they were wicked. And so Lot chooses the cities. We're told that he pitches his tent towards Sodom, whereas Abraham pitches his tent towards the altar he's built for Yahweh. That's our one temple motif in that story, and it's very brief. But what it shows is Abraham stays in the highlands, close to the Lord, with the altar he has built for Yahweh, whereas Lot goes to the cities. And sure enough, when the angels come, Lot meets him at the city gate, which is a reversal. You don't meet the angels at the temple gate, you meet them at the city gate. And Lot knows this is a terrible thing to do because they're not safe. He thinks the men of the city will defile the angels, and it turns out that's what they want to do. And so the only way Lot escapes the destruction of Sodom, of the hellfire that rains down, is to return to the mountain, return to the sacred sanctuary. That's what's implied, but it's very subtle. So look, I think I'm just going to end my presentation there, because I don't know how long we are, but we've already surpassed what I promised that it would be.
Yeah, I think literally any second the Lord's returning at this point. That's how long it's. No, that was just wonderful.
Yeah. So I'm just showing that we have these parallels in the book of Genesis. I am connecting them to the oral tradition of cosmology, mythology, ritual, and sacred center. Those hints are all retained throughout the cosmological stories of Genesis. And so now the question is, how do we reinterpret them as a result? And we can save that for another conversation, but I'm sure your audience can figure out. The one thing we can't do is take it literally, right? But that doesn't mean there's not an enormous amount of beauty. The way the Hebrew scribes actually record these stories is quite elegant. And so I'm just going to end with this quote from my book, Mythos and Cosmos, where I say, what we think about the universe, its origin and structure, turns out to be the box that contains our imaginations. This point cannot be overstated, as civilization's ultimate framework of cultural imagination is its own cosmology. So there's a lot to be said about that. The ancient Israelites built their cosmology around, their temple, their creation story, their sacred cycle, their agricultural cycle, if they grew, and so there was layers of religion and politics and economics and agriculture all within it. But at the same time, there is there's an elegant metaphysics that's contained in there. I'm probably not going to get into it because my 90 minutes is well up. So that's what I've got for you tonight, Derek. Any questions?
That was wonderful, brother. No, actually, everything I tracked with you on, that was really well done. You made me want to go and actually try and find more parallels on purpose. You know what I mean? Because they're there. I know they're there.
There's a lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot. So anyway, there are a lot of believers I don't think notice or even care, but this stuff is really interesting. And so maybe if we do another, we can talk about the great flood myth in the Near Eastern tradition. I promise you, I've got stuff that is new, that no other scholar has tackled it. And so it's really fascinating. Please so do. Until next time.
Yeah.
Derek.
Yes.
God bless you, brother.
Dr. John Knight Lundwall, everybody, go check out the book down in the description. And like I said, he always brings PowerPoints, good visual representation. He knows what he's talking about. Show him some love. You guys go down in the description, get the book. And don't forget, we are Myth Vision. join our Patreon.